Tony Bennett, with humility, decides it's finally time. Chris Graham here, Augusta Free Press. The big news in UVA athletics, obviously this week, not if not this year, if not already the decade. We're only halfway through. Is Tony Bennett deciding to step down this week, just a couple weeks before the season, starting November 6th on a Wednesday night? And he said on Friday, yesterday, as I'm recording this, at a press conference hastily arranged at the John Paul Jones Arena, where there are a lot of banners hanging up because of Tony Bennett and his work there over 15 years. He had to say that it really didn't crystallize for him until he took a couple of days off for fall break. Um, Rare that, in this day and age, a college coach, especially in a revenue sport, football or men's basketball, would get some time off, especially this close to a season. But uh, Tony and his wife, Laurel, took a couple of days, went to the Rappahanock River, uh, enjoyed the scenery, and Tony, after 3 years of going back and forth, decided that maybe it was time to hang it up. So now point out is far from a spur of the moment decision. I mean, if you're watching this, likely if you're a subscriber or you're somebody new coming in, but you read Augusta Free Press, you know that back in the spring, I'd caught wind of murmurs in the backstage, so to speak, at University of Virginia athletics that maybe things were something was up with Tony. I did some public records requests. The Found out that there were some interesting tidbits in the contracts, in the language of contracts for Tony Bennett and his staff that sure looked like that maybe he was thinking about stepping down in 2 years. Not certainly in, at that point it would have been 5 or 6 months away when I was starting to look back at this in April and May. But uh, you know, things happen quicker. But I guess that the public records requests, in my analysis of them, sort of played out. Um, he'd been thinking about it longer than that. Turns out he and Carla Williams, the athletics director at UVA, talked about how Tony's back and forth with himself over his future in college basketball goes back 3 years to 2021. Here's one of the things he had to say, and I'll quote quite a few things he had to say at his presser yesterday. The thing that has choked me up the most and the hardest thing to say is when I looked at myself and I realized I'm no longer the best coach to lead this program in this current environment. And if you're going to do it, you've got to be all in. You've got to have everything. If you do it half-hearted, it's not fair to the university and those young men. He pointed to his team, his players, and actually his coaching staff. Quite a few young men there too. They were at the presser yesterday. And looking at that, it's what made me step down. He was very emotional. Broke up several times as he was talking. I mean, it was an interesting collection of people there at this press conference. Again, it was hastily arranged. Uh, we found out later from Carla Williams that uh, Bennett had reached out to her just on Wednesday to say he was stepping down. She obviously tried to talk him out of it, was unable to. University of Virginia Athletics then on Thursday sent out a note to us in the media at 4:30 p.m. to say that there would be a press conference on Friday morning at 11 a.m. Word had gotten out during the day. Obviously, he talked with his team and his coaches early in the day. So the fact that a lot of folks were able to get together, especially some who had to travel, was significant. Now, the people who didn't have to travel very far, UVA President Jim Ryan, Athletics Director Carla Williams mentioned her. Her predecessor, Craig Littlepage, who's hung around town. He's been a Charlottesville fixture for decades now. Tony Elliott was there, UVA football coach. His team was getting ready to fly down to Clemson. They played today, obviously at noon. So less than 24 hours, or right around 24 hours, I guess, from game time. I understand that his team's flight was scheduled to leave at 12:30. He was there at 11 o'clock and stayed there through the whole 30 minutes roughly of the press conference. Debbie Ryan was there, a legendary former UVA women's basketball coach. Rick Carlisle, that one really impressed me. Rick Carlisle former UVA basketball great. He played on the Final Four team in 1984. He's the coach of the Indiana Pacers, won an NBA championship as the head coach of the Dallas Mavericks. Indiana played a preseason game on Thursday night in Indiana. He either had to fly out after that game to get to Charlottesville or get up way early in the morning and get there, get to the airport, get to Charlottesville Airport and get to JPJ. He walked in a few minutes before 11 o'clock. I was sitting in the back of the room. Here's where I'll admit I've got social anxiety disorder. Um, this is one reason I don't do well in press conference situations. Don't, this disorder just makes it so you don't feel comfortable in rooms full of people who are doing all kinds of different things, right? So, they had set up chairs in the media room in front of the table where Tony and Carla were sitting. TV cameras behind you. I decided, you know what, I'm not going to sit there. I don't feel comfortable there. So I just kind of stood off to the side. And then, as it turns out, that's where a number of these dignitaries decided to stand too. And I was shoulder to shoulder with Ron Sanchez, as it turns out too. Kind of one of those happenstance kind of things. When Rick Carlisle walked in the room, my first instinct, my head, I didn't say a word to anybody as this was going on. It was a very somber situation. It's a retirement ceremony. It kind of felt like a funeral. Nobody was really talking out loud. It was very, very hush hush murmurs and that kind of thing. So Rick Carlisle walks in the room, and I'm thinking that's Rick Carlisle, and just kind of looking. That can't be Rick Carlisle. There's no way that's Rick Carlisle. What's Rick Carlisle doing here? What a tribute for him to prioritize getting there. Given that he's got a job right now with the NBA season on, starting next week, I guess. Lars Tiffany, I mean, among Amakwa Agugwa Hamilton, the Coach Mox, the women's coach, but Lars Tiffany was there, the UVA national championship winning lacrosse coach, and he stood, back in that area where I was, and I can tell you because I was standing there that when Tony finally walked in the room, right, like a minute or two after 11 o'clock, um, Tony walked by, and then Lars Tiffany looked at somebody. I don't know who he was talking with, but Lars looked at someone standing beside him and said, "Should we clap? I think we should clap." And he started clapping, and that's when the room started clapping. Like that kind of broke a little bit of the ice because again, everybody was on pins and needles. We knew what was happening. You just didn't want to see it happen. It's almost like I saw a comment on social media to the effect that maybe Tony will just show up to work on Monday and Paula George Costanza show up to work on Monday and act like nothing happened. And so maybe there was thought, hey, Tony could reconsider, and he's not going to do this. But um, yeah, it was a real surreal kind of thing to be a part of. Tony Bennett, having the success he's had in a program that for us and in UVA sports fans, UVA alums, um, for me, I'm one of both. I've been a UVA sports fan since I was in elementary school, so that's going back 45 years or so. Basketball is the sport. Men's basketball is the sport that has our attention. Football season, is what it is. Baseball season, I love following the baseball team. Have season tickets to baseball. I'm a journalist, but I still sit in the stands with my wife and have popcorn and a beer. I fly out to the College World Series when they go, and I cover the World Series. The last 2 years, I'm 0-4. They might not let me back. But basketball is what motivates us since the Ralph Sampson, Terry Holland era. Um, and Tony Bennett is the guy who finally led us to the national championship. And I was fortunate to be there as well in the Final Four. I was sitting second row from the court when the streamers started falling. I was sitting in a section with other UVA media there, the blogger section. Those of us who I think all of us were alums that I was sitting with, four or five of us, the tears going down our face. I mean, that's what that does. Sports can do that to you, right? And Tony Tony made that possible. Um, and I say all that to say the idea that this guy doesn't think he is the one best equipped to lead the program going forward is several things. It's a manifestation of his humility. He talked a lot. He can still talk. He's not dead. He's just not the coach anymore. His famous five pillars. Humility is the first one. Um, so that's one of the things that this day is about. It's about his humility. He could easily stay on and figure his way through this difficult era, the transfer portal being the most difficult part of the transition. He could figure his way out through it. He's a smart guy. but he decided that he didn't think he was best equipped to do that. That takes a humble person to do that. Two, it's a sad day for the University of Virginia family that we had this purest of guys that won all these ACC championships, one national championship, couple ACC tournaments, sending guys overlooked by everybody to the NBA, helping a lot of young men along the path to, success outside of basketball after they graduated. And he's gone. That's a sad day. And the reason why he's gone is itself an indictment of college athletics. I'll just say it. And more to the point, the inability of those in charge to figure out how to balance the pursuit of money in the best interest of people involved. I'm going to talk a lot more about that, down the line, write columns and just do some separate podcasts. But the quick thought there is, this isn't just about money. It's not just about the transfer portal. It's about the lack of a structure. Um, and for the Pat Forties of the world, I wrote a column about Pat Forty's ignorant column that he wrote for SI.com, which is very close to going out of business, has been for a little while. His whole thing was, well, college coaches like Tony Bennett crave control. Anybody craves control there, Pat. Your editors, if they're still actually people and not AI, crave control. They want to make sure you're actually writing your columns when you are supposed to. Anybody who's watching this, if you're the boss, you want control of your employees. If you're an employee, your boss wants to know what you're doing. And as far as sports goes, when you look at the professional sports leagues, which college sports is becoming professional, especially football and men's basketball, the NBA, MLB, NFL, NHL, the soccer leagues, all have things like contracts that guys and gals sign. And if you sign a 2-year deal, you can't just up and leave in the middle of year one and say, I'm going to go play somewhere else. It's simple things like that, and that would actually benefit the student athletes. I'm all for anybody who reads my columns knows that, I'm not. I think college coaches are overpaid relative to how much revenue that their programs generate. Tony Bennett was making over $4 million a year. UVA basketball last year generated around $19 million. No CEO in any business that generates $19 million, no CEO of a company is going to make $4 million of that $19 million. We're dramatically overpaying these people to run these programs. But to me, it would also benefit the student athletes if, for time immemorial, since scholarships were given out, have been given out to student athletes. People assume you get a scholarship, people on the outside, you get a scholarship, that's a 4-year scholarship. No, it's a 1-year renewable. They're 1-year contracts. So, in the future, part of what the NCAA needs to do here is, address that. If you can sign an athlete to a 1-year contract, maybe you can offer athletes that think more highly of from a recruiting standpoint to a 2-year deal or a 3-year deal. Then they're not going to just up and leave or be able to up and leave. But you're committing more to them. You're giving them more there too. And I know that this settlement called the House settlement that's through the process of being approved is going to actually lead to the NCAA and its member institutions paying athletes directly. NIL is not direct money to the athletes. That's from the schools. That's money that's sort of like Caitlin Clark endorsing Nike. That's outside money. Um, there's going to be money coming from the institutions as well, coming up soon. That's going to have some repercussions in addition. So, but I've been thinking for the last couple of years that Tony was probably just holding out, hoping that this would get resolved. I have to assume that he is looking at the landscape and saying it's nowhere close to being resolved. And if I'm speaking for Tony Bennett, I can't do this anymore. I can't be a part of this anymore. Not that he doesn't want to be a part of it philosophically, just that he's not the guy to be a coach, and a CEO of a program, best equipped to be that guy. So, um, talking about the weekend to clear his mind. This is a quote from him. Every coach, you get to that point, it's a long season, a hard ending. He was talking about at the end of last year, after last season, the 23, I think it was 23-11 finish, that ugly loss to Colorado State in the first four. After the really just heartbreaking, or not heartbreaking, it was because I guess there was a little bit of heartbreak. NC State hit a three at the end of that ACC tournament semifinal game to send it to overtime after a missed Isaac Beneely free throw opened the door, and then NC State dominated the overtime to beat Virginia, knock UVA out of the ACC tournament. But uh, there was so a couple losses at the end of the season. UVA knocked out, really frustrating end of last season. And Tony admitted that he thought about stepping down. He thought maybe his time was up. He said though a part of what kept him from doing that was he just didn't have a lot of time to mull things over because as soon as the season ends, you turn right to the transfer portal because you got guys leaving. In his case, he had a couple of seniors, in addition to Reese Beekman going to the NBA draft. Beekman could have come back. He was a senior, but could have come back for one more year. And he's now going to be a G League guy. He's getting garbage time minutes in the preseason with Golden State, but he's moving forward. Ryan Dunn, a surprise that he was a first round pick and is actually playing pretty well in the preseason for Phoenix. Had 20 points the other night, six three-pointers. He had seven threes all last season at UVA. Great to see him playing well. But Tony had to refurbish the roster. I guess he decided I gotta work. Instead of thinking about himself, he put his mind to work and then worked with his staff. They re-recruited a pretty solid transfer portal class. Um, he admitted that a lot of that work, in terms of the grunt work, went to his staff, but he hung around to be a part of that. Went through the summer. Now, I will say that as the summer went on, word started circulating out of the program, getting to us here at AFP, certainly, that Bennett had ceded a lot of the control of the day-to-day basketball stuff, I keep calling it, to Ron Sanchez, who's now the interim coach. Ron was working with the players in individual workouts, small group workouts, and eventually when practice started here a few weeks ago, on up temp, increasing the tempo. Not necessarily playing Loyola Marymount. I'm not trying to say that, but definitely increasing the tempo. Um, this spring, so this is where I inject myself in the story. This spring, when I did the FOIA work that led to the contract information discoveries that Tony's contract was up in 2 years. He eventually signed a 5-year extension of that deal, but I have to think that it was a lot of that was the pressure that came from my writing about it. And I'm not patting myself on the back or, walking around here with a big head. There's no reason that they signed him to a 5-year extension except for the fact that I made that public, and also made public that Ron Sanchez was the one assistant coach who actually had a contract longer than Tony's contract, which suggested to me that Ron Sanchez was perhaps the coach in waiting. I think we've confirmed all that now. That Tony now is saying that, Tony and Carla Williams were both saying that he was thinking as far back as 3 years ago about his tenure coming to an end. He didn't sign a contract extension for the last few years. His contract was up in 2 years. He rehires Ron Sanchez, who had left for 5 years to be a head coach at Charlotte, gives up the head coaching job after winning 22 games, comes back last summer to be an assistant coach. There's no way that Ron Sanchez came back to be an assistant coach. He came back to be the head coach in waiting. So that's where we are. Told you that 6 months ago. I was pilloried for doing that. I was called fringe media for doing that. And I'm not, the fan in me and alum in me is not happy that I was right, but I was right, as it turns out. And let's take the good out of what we learned this summer. Again, that Sanchez was given a lot of the reins for the day-to-day basketball stuff. So that should ease the transition, as there's, just a couple of weeks now, 2.5 weeks until the season starts, um, for Sanchez to now move up that chair. It's one thing to have to be the top assistant coach and be given a lot of control over practice situations and drills and things like that. But now, with Tony still there behind you, but now Tony's not there. Now Sanchez is the guy. So we'll see. That's a transition for him. It's a transition for the players to get used to. He's the guy to turn to, but it's going to be a transition for Sanchez too. He doesn't have Tony Bennett to lean on. Sanchez is moving from the role of being Don Zimmer to Joe Torre. The Don Zimmer being a guy who was a head coach, head manager in baseball, and then was the sounding board for Joe Torre on all those great Yankees teams back in the '90s, early 2000s. He doesn't he's Zimmer now being Torre, and he doesn't have another Torre. I mean, he's got Jason Williford certainly, but that their interactions now are going to be different. Those two guys were fellow assistants together for a long time. Sanchez gone for those 5 years at Charlotte back last year. They have been cohorts for a number of years together, and now all of a sudden, one of the two guys is a boss. It's going to be different. So, a lot of transition there. Um, Bennett said, kind of getting back to his story, he said as the summer wore on, he was encouraged. He was excited for this way forward. And even last week at the ACC basketball tip-off, he sounded excited. He talked about, increasing the tempo. He did lament the state of the business side of college basketball. But he's still, left there. It sounded like, hey, this guy's, certainly nobody. He didn't leave. Watching him do his interviews at the ACC tip-off, thinking, oh yeah, this guy's quitting in a week. Um, but after that, that's when he took the trip to the Rappahannock. That's out there on the eastern side of Virginia. I don't want to call it the Eastern Shore because Maryland has an Eastern Shore, but out there in the water part of Virginia, beautiful, quiet place out there. The tide's in. I know some folks who stayed there. Got some emails from folks who stayed there and talk about just how beautiful it is, and how quiet it is. And for a guy who's constantly on the go, quiet's probably important. He said he got back from there, got to Charlottesville, and he was able to sit on this decision that sounds like he made over the weekend all the way until Wednesday. But that's when he talked to Carla Williams, and she said that I think I mentioned this earlier. She said she did her best. She tried to talk him out of it, but it also sounded like, from talking with Carla for a few minutes after the press conference, it sounded like she's been talking him out of it for 3 years. She didn't say that directly, but it felt like that's what she was saying. Because she, the way the press conference with Tony was up in front of the cameras, and you're at a table. The talk with Carla was, after that event was over, after the cameras had been turned off, and you're kind of just chatting with her off to the side. And the way that kind of works is, I was there with her from the start of it, but some other reporters were kind of coming in and out, so she had to answer the same question, that main question, 3 or 4 times when I was there with her, and hearing it, and then hearing the additions each time as she went through it to the next guy who asked the same question. It was just like, yeah, it kind of feels like that this has been maybe a job number one for her. I mean, she had to replace a football coach that she ran off, but also, just as important, she's been trying to keep her very successful men's basketball coach from deciding to step down, and it's not easy in that respect. Um, so, I wanted to give some context here. I mean, Tony's 55. Roy Williams retired at 71. He looked like he was 90. And no offense to Roy, but man, the job ages you. Tony even joked that, he took the job 15 years ago. He was 39. So, a little bit more than 15 years ago. He looked boyish then. He joked at the presser on Friday to his wife, you look like this, you look the same that you did 15 years ago. I look like I've aged 30 years. It's kind of like you see out of presidents. Barack Obama, I think, was 46 when he got the presidency, and he left looking like he was about 70. George Bush was a young 50 or 51 and looks really old now. I mean, when you have a pressure job, it does age you accelerated. So Roy was in that situation. Mike Krzyzewski was 75 when he retired. Jim Boeheim made it all the way to 78. Now, Tony Bennett made it clear he was not a basketball lifer. We've been hearing for years behind the scenes, and I've reported on it, let it out here and there in writing and on podcast. He made it clear for several years he's not a lifer. He was not going to be there until his mid 60s, his early 70s, anything like that. He had a idea of his longevity, his shelf life. Give him 5 more years, give him 10 more years though, and there are going to be a couple more banners at least hung up there. I'm not wouldn't you can't guarantee a national title banner, but UVA's got the resources from an NIL standpoint. It's got the resources from fan base. The business side of basketball is pretty solid, that UVA can compete with anybody in the country. Will be able to going forward, with Ron Sanchez, whoever ends up being the full-time head coach going forward. But with Tony Bennett in place, there were going to be more banners hanging. One of the reporters asked him during the press conference, if he was at peace with his decision to step down at this time. He said, "I am at peace. When you know in your heart it's time," is what he said. Will I miss the game? Do I love the game? Absolutely. But I don't think I'm equipped in this new way to coach, and it's a disservice if you keep doing that. That's tough. That's tough. He's going to be in the Hall of Fame. He's going to be in the college basketball Hall of Fame, and he doesn't think he can do the job in this system. Now, part of the difficulty is not just the dealing with the Wild West in terms of roster construction. Again, we're probably a couple years away. Hopefully 1 or 2 or 3 years away, not 5 years away, from there being more stability in terms of, right, schools can sign players for more than 1 year. And that would provide some stability. You could give 2 year contracts that would give you some stability, that kind of thing. Um, but even that wouldn't necessarily jibe with Tony Bennett's approach. His approach, which he inherited from his father, the pack line defense, the mover blocker, continuity flow offense, they take time to develop. I mean, guys have to give up of themselves to be a part of it. It produces. Virginia's got the sixth most players in the NBA, the current NBA rosters. Um, but it's not something that you just simply. It's not AAU ball. It's not something you roll the ball out there and let them play. You're not playing one-on-one defense with no help. You're not playing one-on-one offense or just a high pick and roll offense. You have to do a lot of stuff, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of learning, especially on the defensive side. And to be a good Tony Bennett player, you got to know your strengths and your weaknesses. And again, be willing to be humble, like the coach. I look at that and say Tony Bennett, just like he asked his players for 15 years at UVA, the 3 years he was a head coach at Washington State, he's playing within his abilities. He's not trying to do more than he can do. He came up as a coach who inherited a system from his father, Dick Bennett, who took that system from being a D3 coach. I mean, the lowest level of, well, NAIA would be the lowest level of the game, but D3 is right there with it. He was very successful at D3, made his way up to D1. He won at Wisconsin. He won at Washington State, with a system that he developed that takes advantage of. You don't need to have five-star players. You don't need to have the next NBA guy to be successful in the Dick Bennett, Tony Bennett system. But it takes 4 years. You have to have guys together for a while. I mean, you think about Tony's UVA teams that were the best. The 2013-2014 team. You had Joe Harris as a senior. You had Malcolm Brogdon and Anthony Gill as redshirt sophomores who played together for a time. The 2018-2019 team, Kyle Guy, Ty Jerome, DeAndre Hunter were all third-year players. Hunter was a redshirt sophomore, but he'd played in the system for 3 years. Jay Huff was a third-year player. Mamadi Diakite was a fourth-year player. His veteran teams were really good. But in this era of not even knowing if a guy's back next year, it's hard to play the style of ball that Tony plays. AEU ball coaches, no offense to them. I mean, if it works, it works. If you can coach up, if you can just collect talent and then look at them and say, "Here's what we're going to do," and coach them up, great. That's John Shire at Duke, who inherited that from Mike Krzyzewski. You just get a bunch of 5 stars and go out there and play. Not everybody can do that. There's only so many guys who would otherwise be in the NBA, if not for the one and done rule, that have to go to college for pretend to go to college for a year. There's only so many of those. Steve Forbes at Wake Forest has been attempting for 5 years. He doesn't get the one and dones, obviously, but he gets really good players at Wake Forest from other places, uh, from the transfer portal, and I mean, he's gotten some really, really talented players and puts them together. And you look out there physically, and these guys are great. They're athletic as heck. He hasn't made an NCAA tournament in 5 years. So that's the other side of that coin. It's not easy to do that either. But it's certainly not easy to do what Tony Bennett does. Um, and so, in a way, the game has passed Tony Bennett by, and he's admitting that. So I've been hinting to that, and when I would say it or write it, I'd get angry emails, but I wasn't insulting, I wasn't denigrating. It was just a recognition of reality. Um, just like there were great writers and editors from 40 years ago who would not do the job I'm doing now as well as I'm doing it. I'm not a better writer than any of those people or a better communicator than any of those people, but I'm better at this stuff than they could possibly be because it's just not what they knew. Well, Tony Bennett kind of in the same way. And so, that's the story as far as Tony Bennett goes. It's tough. Now Ron Sanchez will be the guy. Sanchez is a guy that um, he's been with Tony and with the Bennetts with Dick Bennett for a long time. So Dick Bennett stepped down early in the 2000 season, actually a few games into that season, and handed over the reins to his at that time top assistant Brad Soderberg, who's been on the staff with Tony Bennett at UVA for a long time. Um, and then Dick, he was burnt out, 57 years old, felt burnt out, decided it was lured out of retirement in 2003 at Washington State. Hired Tony as an assistant there. Tony found a guy named Ron Sanchez who'd been an assistant in a couple of mid-major D1 programs. The Bennett's brought Sanchez on as director of basketball operations at first. He eventually became an assistant coach on the staff, and then when Dick Bennett stepped down after I think it was the 2005-2006 season, he was coach for 3 years, and then Tony was coach for 3 years at Washington State. Tony made Ron his full-time top assistant at Washington State. Tony was a national coach of the year there in his second season, and then was offered the job at Indiana. Um, Famously turned that down to the chagrin, especially now, of but it was even chagrin even then of Indiana fans. But then a year later, Virginia was trying to lure him, and after the failure of the Dave Leto era, and Sanchez was the guy that flew out to the East Coast with Tony to look at UVA, and they looked around. They saw the wonder that was JPJ. They looked at the situation with UVA and how much money UVA has, and decided that they decided together we can do something here, and eventually took the job came took the job, came here, have won. And I mentioned that Sanchez left in 2018 to be the coach at Charlotte. Kind of makes me think that he left, whether it was a plan, I don't want to say that it was a plan with him and Tony. Hey, go there and coach for a few years and come back here, and then I'll make you the coach. It was probably more along the lines of, if you want to be a head coach, Ron, you need to be a head coach. You need to go somewhere and be a head coach. You can't be an assistant forever and then all of a sudden be the head coach at a place like Virginia. That's just not going to work. And so Ron went to Charlotte for 4 years. It was a program that had three winning seasons in the previous 10. He got them back over 500 in year two. By his year five, he won 22 games, and then he came back to UVA. Now, I do think at that time, I think based on everything that I've learned in the public record searches from a few months ago, that he came back with, whether it was a tacit promise or some concept of a plan, that he would be the first in line to be the guy who would replace Tony whenever that would be. I don't think Tony even thought, and certainly Sanchez didn't think. I can't imagine that in the summer of 2023 that it would be a year and a couple months later. But here it is in that situation. So Sanchez is a guy that he's cut his teeth and has become long of tooth in the Dick Bennett, Tony Bennett system. 20 plus years in the Dick Bennett system, but he did get to spread his wings a bit. And I looked at the numbers that his Charlotte teams put up. Now, his last team, his successful team, the one that won 22 games, he did average that team averaged 60.4 possessions a game and was actually ranked one spot ahead of Tony Bennett's UVA team that year in adjusted tempo. Tony Bennett's UVA team's always, either last or next to last or something of that nature in tempo in the country. Out of 360 plus teams, Tony's always ranked 360 something in that ranking. But the year before, Sanchez had a winning record with a team that averaged 65.5 possessions per game. The year before that, I think his team was like 64.5 or 64.6. So, it doesn't sound like much, 4 or 5 more possessions per game, but Duke last year averaged 66 possessions per game. So think about the pace that Duke plays at versus the pace that Virginia plays at. And, that's that 5 or 6 possessions per game. It's 5 or 6 transition possessions per game. And Sanchez has experience having done that on his own. And that he'd been working to get the Virginia offense to speed up a little bit to try to push transition when opportunities present, fast breaks or secondary breaks. And so, um, Tony's had already handed that off to Ron to tweak and implement. And now it's Ron's baby, and we'll see how that works as far as that goes. Um, Tony thinks he's left the program in good hands. He's excited for the players. He said they'll have to grow together. They have a very tough schedule coming up. That's because Tony, I like to say this about Tony Bennett. You can tell what he thinks about his team based on what his schedule is from year to year. He scheduled this season to be tough, and I think that says he thinks this is going to be a pretty good team. And earlier this week, before Tony stepped down, the ACC media voted Virginia fifth, picked Virginia fifth in the preseason out of 18 teams now. Fifth back in the old days out of eight, you'd be second division, fifth out of 18. You're like a top 20 team in the country as far as that goes. Now, they didn't make the AP top 25, whatever that matters. I think that fifth in the ACC, I think that what we're seeing out of this team translates to 23 to 25 wins. Now, it's important to note that Sanchez is the interim coach. Also important to note that as we were talking with Carla Williams after the presser yesterday and the little gaggle we had with her off to the side, she emphasized that there will be a national search conducted. She did not give time frame on that because it was Friday after learning on Wednesday that her meal ticket guy was stepping down. So I can forgive her for that, but I will say out loud that the fact that there's not a head coach under contract as a head coach at UVA makes it a little different. You're not going to go out and you can't contractually go out and conduct it. You can't start vetting, gauging interest, formally gauging interest with other possible interest, possibly interested coaches. You can't hire a firm to vet them. You can't talk with their agents while you have a existing head coach under contract on staff. I would have to presume that if an existing head coach was in a last year of a contract and indicated they're not going to sign another contract, there may be a loophole there. But Ron Sanchez is under contract to the University of Virginia as an associate head coach. So Virginia can certainly start that process whenever they want to. They can hire a search firm if that's the route. A lot of schools go that route, hiring a search firm to handle the grunt work, handle the work of uh, contacting agents. You're not contacting the coach directly. You're contacting the coach's agent. Hey, would this guy perhaps be interested in the job? Getting a pool of applicants, so to speak, they're not applying because you're asking, but you get a pool of those candidates, I guess would be the better word to put. Then you start vetting them. Perhaps, they're under contract too, so they're not going to be able to necessarily, obviously, I would assume, there's, I can't imagine there'd be anybody out there that is not under contract right now that you'd be contacting, but okay, so I threw that out there. But you can start doing your internal study so that when the season ends in March, you could then start formally reaching out because if the season doesn't go well, and it's certainly a possibility, uh, you may be going in that direction. So, and if you're going in that direction, you want to have the first whack at it. You don't want to be, getting the third or fourth choice. You want your first choice. UVA's got more money than God. They can figure out how to do this. They're gonna, if something happens and this season doesn't work out for Ron Sanchez, then they want to get the guy they want. Um, I'm rooting for Sanchez to do well. I think this team can win 23 to 25 games. If they win 23 to 25 games, he's the coach. You keep your staff together, you keep the players together. So, um, but man, it is October 19th. Word slipped out today that Virginia got pantsed in a secret scrimmage. by VCU. Whatever value there is there. Last 2 years, UVA had beaten UConn in secret scrimmages, and we saw how that worked out. UConn's the back-to-back defending national champion. UVA hasn't won an NCAA tournament game since 2019. So take that for what you will. But this it's there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on, and I haven't even talked about football today for a good reason. Okay, so that's a long-winded me talking to myself to a camera. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any observations, if you have any news tips, hey, you might have heard something I didn't hear. That's how I get to know stuff is because people tell me stuff. I would love it if you would feel free to email me at chris@augustafreepress.com.